You made it all up, he said without listening. 4 years later, two identical green-eyed boys proved just how wrong the millionaire CEO had been. The words had been spoken years ago, but they still lived in Ethan Miller's memory with unsettling clarity. You made it all up. He had said it without hesitation, without anger even, just a flat certainty that left no room for argument. At the time, he had believed that confidence was strength, that refusing to doubt himself was the reason he stood at the top of his world. Now he stood in the center of a grand charity hall, surrounded by crystal chandeliers and carefully arranged smiles, the air filled with polite laughter and the soft clinking of glasses. He was the main sponsor of the evening, the man whose name appeared on banners and invitations, the man people thanked before they even knew why. His dark suit fit him perfectly, his brown hair neatly styled, his green eyes sharp and observant as they moved across the crowd with practiced detachment. Ethan did not expect to see the past tonight. He had trained himself to believe it was finished, sealed away behind success and time. The woman he once dismissed had become a closed chapter, something uncomfortable but irrelevant. Or so he thought. He noticed her first not because she looked lost or uncertain, but because she looked exactly the opposite. She stood near the stage, speaking calmly with members of the organizing team, her posture confident, her presence quietly commanding attention. Her brown hair fell neatly over her shoulders, her expression composed in a way that suggested she belonged here just as much as anyone else in the room. Sarah Brooks. The realization struck him slowly, like a delayed echo. His chest tightened as memory collided with reality, and for a brief moment, the noise of the room seemed to fade. He told himself he was mistaken, that the resemblance was coincidence, that the past was playing tricks on him. Then she turned slightly, and there was no longer any doubt. Before Ethan could fully process the shock, his gaze shifted, and everything changed. Standing beside Sarah were two small boys, no more than 4 years old, dressed neatly for the occasion, their hands loosely held at her sides. They were identical, from the shape of their faces to the way they stood, watching the room with curious, serious expressions far too familiar to ignore. Brown hair. Green eyes. Ethan's breath caught painfully in his throat. He recognized those eyes immediately, not because someone had pointed them out, but because he had lived with them his entire life. The same intense shade of green stared back at him now, multiplied, mirrored in two small faces that should not have existed. His mind scrambled for explanations, for logic, for coincidence. There had to be another answer. There always was. Sarah stepped onto the stage then, the lights brightening around her as the host introduced her as the organizer of the evening. Applause filled the hall, but Ethan barely heard it. His focus remained locked on the boys, on the way one leaned slightly toward the other, on the familiar seriousness in their expressions. A sudden, unwelcome thought pushed through his denial. This was no coincidence. As Sarah began to speak, poised and composed, Ethan felt something unfamiliar creep into his chest, something dangerously close to fear. The sentence he had once thrown at her so easily replayed in his mind, louder now, heavier. You made it all up. The confidence he once felt in those words began to crack. Because now, standing in front of him, were two undeniable reasons proving just how wrong he might have been. Ethan barely registered the applause that followed Sarah's opening remarks. The sound washed over him like distant static, present but meaningless, as his attention remained fixed on the two boys standing beside her. They shifted their weight slightly, one mirroring the other without realizing it, their movements instinctively synchronized in a way that felt painfully intimate. It was not something you learned. It was something you were born with. He tried to ground himself by focusing on details he could control. The cut of his suit. The familiar weight of his watch on his wrist. The slow, steady rhythm of his breathing. None of it helped. His eyes kept returning to the children, tracing the line of their brows, the set of their mouths, the unmistakable intensity in their green eyes that mirrored his own reflection more clearly than any photograph ever had. This was impossible, he told himself. Completely impossible. Sarah finished speaking and stepped down from the stage, immediately surrounded by guests offering praise and thanks. She accepted it all with practiced ease, smiling politely, nodding, moving with the quiet authority of someone who had earned her place through effort rather than entitlement. Ethan watched her from across the room, struck by how little she resembled the woman he had dismissed years ago. There was no hesitation in her movements now, no need to prove herself. She belonged here. And then, as if sensing his gaze, she looked up. Their eyes met. For a fraction of a second, something flickered across Sarah's face. Surprise, quickly masked by composure. Recognition, followed by a tightening of her jaw. She did not smile. She did not look away. She simply acknowledged his presence with a steady, unreadable expression, then turned her attention back to the guests beside her. That quiet restraint unsettled Ethan more than anger ever could have. He found himself moving without fully deciding to. His feet carried him through the crowd, past familiar faces and polite nods he barely returned, his mind racing ahead of his body. Each step brought him closer to a truth he had avoided for years, a truth that now stood in front of him in the form of two small boys tugging gently at Sarah's hands. One of them looked up at her and whispered something. She bent slightly to listen, her posture softening in a way that made Ethan's chest tighten unexpectedly. The other boy watched the room with calm curiosity, his gaze briefly landing on Ethan before drifting away again, uninterested, unafraid. The casual indifference stung more than recognition would have. Ethan stopped a few feet away, close enough to hear their voices now, close enough to notice the way the boys leaned toward Sarah instinctively, anchored to her presence. He cleared his throat, suddenly unsure of how to begin, of what words could possibly bridge the distance between accusation and reality. Sarah turned to face him fully. "Mr. Miller," she said evenly, her tone professional, controlled. "I didn't expect to see you here." The formality landed like a quiet rebuke. He had been Ethan once. Now he was a title. "I didn't know you were the organizer," he replied, hearing the stiffness in his own voice and hating it. "Neither did you ask," she said simply. Before he could respond, one of the boys tugged at her dress. "Mom, who's that?" The word hit Ethan harder than any confrontation could have. Sarah hesitated for just a moment, then answered calmly. "That's Mr. Miller. He helped make tonight possible." The boy studied Ethan openly, head tilted slightly. "He looks like us," he said, not accusing, not curious, just stating a fact. Ethan felt his carefully constructed composure fracture. Sarah's eyes flicked to him, sharp now, warning. "Go wait by the table," she said gently to the boys. "I'll be right there." They obeyed without question, walking a few steps away but staying within sight. Ethan watched them go, every instinct screaming that this was a line he could not uncross without consequences. "How old are they?" he asked quietly. Sarah met his gaze without flinching. 4. The calculation happened instantly in his mind, brutal and undeniable. Time aligned itself with memory in a way that left no room for denial. The accusation. The argument. The door closing behind her. The silence stretched. "You told me you were pregnant," he said finally, his voice rougher than he intended. "I didn't believe you." "No," Sarah replied. "You told me I was lying." The distinction mattered. Ethan swallowed hard. Are they? Sarah held his gaze for a long moment, then answered with quiet finality. Yes. They're yours. The room did not spin. The lights did not dim. There was no dramatic collapse. Instead, a heavy, crushing clarity settled over him, steady and inescapable. For years of birthdays he had missed, of first words he had never heard, of lives that had continued perfectly well without him. You said I made it all up, Sarah continued, her voice calm but edged with something deeper. I believed you wouldn't listen. So I stopped trying. Ethan looked past her to the boys, laughing softly at something only they understood, and for the first time in his life, success felt meaningless. He had been certain once. And now certainty was the one thing he no longer trusted. Ethan left the charity hall later that night with the uneasy feeling that the ground beneath his life had shifted without warning. The applause, the speeches, the congratulations meant nothing to him anymore. Even the familiar weight of authority he carried so comfortably felt foreign now, as if it belonged to someone else entirely. He sat in the back of the car on the ride home, staring out at the city lights while the image of two identical boys with his eyes replayed endlessly in his mind. Sleep did not come. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Sarah standing on that stage, calm and unshaken, flanked by children who should have been impossible. His memory betrayed him, dragging him back to the night he had dismissed her, to the way he had said those words with such certainty. You made it all up. At the time, it had felt like closure. Now it felt like a verdict passed without trial. By morning, denial had given way to urgency. Ethan cancelled his meetings without explanation, something he had rarely done in years. He sat alone in his office, staring at his phone for a long time before finally dialing Sarah's number. It rang several times before she answered. Yes? Her voice was controlled, distant. We need to talk, he said. Properly. Not in a hallway. There was a pause on the line. There's nothing left to discuss, she replied. I know you don't owe me anything, Ethan said carefully. But they deserve clarity. And so do I. Silence stretched again, heavier this time. Tomorrow, Sarah finally said. 1 hour. Somewhere public. Relief washed through him, tempered by the understanding that this was not forgiveness, only permission. They met the next afternoon in a quiet cafe far from the center of the city. Sarah arrived first, the boys with her, both holding small toy cars and talking to each other in low voices. When Ethan walked in, they noticed him immediately, studying him with open curiosity. He resisted the urge to approach them, instead stopping a few steps away and waiting for Sarah to acknowledge him. She gestured toward the chair across from her. Sit. Ethan obeyed, suddenly aware of how large and intrusive he felt in the small space. He folded his hands together, unsure where to look, unsure what was appropriate. These are Lucas and Noah, Sarah said calmly. Hearing their names made something in his chest tighten. They're healthy, she continued. They're happy. And they don't need confusion. I don't want to confuse them, Ethan said. I want to understand. Sarah met his gaze, her expression unreadable. Understanding now doesn't undo 4 years. I know, he said quietly. But I need to know how this happened. Why you never told me. I did tell you, she replied. You didn't believe me. And after that, I chose stability over explanations. She spoke without bitterness, which made the truth harder to bear. She told him everything then. About discovering the pregnancy. About the fear and the doctor's appointments she attended alone. About the nights she cried quietly so the boys wouldn't sense her panic. She did not dramatize or accuse. She simply stated facts, each one landing with quiet force. Ethan listened, his chest tightening with every word. When they were born, Sarah continued, I looked at them and saw you immediately. Not because of their eyes, but because of their intensity. I knew then that I had made the right choice by leaving. The words cut deeper than anger would have. You didn't need me, Ethan said. I didn't need you, Sarah agreed. They might have. But need and trust are not the same thing. The boys interrupted them, climbing onto the chair beside Sarah, whispering to each other and laughing. Ethan watched them, noting how they leaned toward her instinctively, how secure they were in her presence. Can I talk to them? He asked hesitantly. Sarah considered the question carefully. Not today, she said. You're still a stranger to them. Ethan nodded, accepting the boundary without argument. As the hour ended, Sarah stood, gathering the boys' jackets. This doesn't mean anything has changed, she said. I agreed to talk because the truth was already out. I understand, Ethan replied. She paused, then added, if you want to be involved, it will be slow. On their terms. Not yours. I'll do whatever it takes, he said. Sarah did not respond. She took the boy's hands and walked out of the cafe, leaving Ethan seated alone with the quiet certainty that his life had divided itself into two clear halves. Everything before this moment. And everything that would have to change after. The days that followed were marked by a strange, exhausting stillness. Ethan moved through his life as if through water, everything slowed, dulled, resistant. Meetings resumed, emails demanded replies, people spoke to him with the same deference as always, yet none of it reached him in the same way. Every conversation felt superficial compared to the quiet weight pressing against his chest, a weight shaped unmistakably like two small boys he could not stop thinking about. He replayed the cafe conversation endlessly, dissecting every word Sarah had said, every boundary she had drawn with such calm certainty. What unsettled him most was not her anger, but her composure. She had not asked him for anything. She had not demanded apologies or explanations. She had simply stated facts and protected her children, and in doing so, she had exposed how little control he truly had. For the first time in his life, Ethan did not know what the next correct move was. He began researching quietly, not through lawyers or investigators, but through late nights and uncomfortable honesty with himself. He read about children his son's age, about developmental stages and emotional needs, about how trust formed and how easily it could be broken. Each article felt like a reminder of how much time had passed without him, how much he could never reclaim. When Sarah finally agreed to let him see the boys again, it was under conditions so precise they left no room for interpretation. A park. 1 hour. She would be present the entire time. No promises. No explanations. No physical affection unless initiated by the children. Ethan arrived early. He stood near the edge of the park, hands in his pockets, watching families pass by, feeling acutely aware of his own place among them. When Sarah appeared with Lucas and Noah, his breath caught despite his effort to remain composed. The boys walked ahead of her, arguing quietly over whose turn it was to hold a toy plane, their voices blending together in perfect sync. They stopped a few feet away. This is Ethan, Sarah said calmly, not using his title, not assigning him a role. You can say hello if you want. The boys studied him openly. Lucas was the first to speak. Hi, he said, his tone neutral. "Hi," Noah echoed, mirroring him instinctively. "Hello," Ethan replied, crouching slightly to lower himself to their eye level without invading their space. "It's nice to meet you." They accepted this without reaction, quickly returning to their toy, kneeling in the grass and resuming their game as if Ethan were just another background detail. The dismissal stung more than rejection would have, but Ethan forced himself to accept it. Sarah watched closely, her posture relaxed but her attention sharp. As the minutes passed, Ethan spoke only when spoken to. He answered questions honestly but briefly. He did not reach for the boys, did not interrupt their play, did not try to impress them. He sat on a nearby bench and observed, learning their rhythms, the way Lucas frowned in concentration, the way Noah laughed first and louder. Eventually, Noah wandered closer. "Why do you look sad?" he asked suddenly. Ethan hesitated, then answered truthfully. "Because I missed some important things." Noah considered this. "Did you lose them?" "Yes," Ethan said quietly. "I did." Noah nodded, satisfied, and returned to his brother. The simplicity of the exchange nearly undid him. When the hour ended, Sarah gathered the boys and announced it was time to go. Ethan stood, resisting the instinct to ask for more. "Thank you," he said to Sarah, "for letting me be here." "This was for them," she replied evenly. "Not for you." He accepted that. That night, Ethan sat alone in his apartment, the silence heavier than it had ever been. He understood now that reconciliation was not something he could demand or negotiate. It was something that would have to be earned slowly, quietly, through consistency rather than words. For the first time, he did not feel powerful. He felt accountable. And that realization, uncomfortable and humbling as it was, marked the true beginning of everything that would follow. Time began to stretch in unfamiliar ways after that first supervised meeting. Ethan learned quickly that progress would not be marked by dramatic breakthroughs or emotional declarations, but by quiet repetitions that tested his patience more than any negotiation ever had. He returned to the park the following week at the exact minute Sarah had specified, resisting the urge to arrive early again, understanding that even eagerness could feel like pressure in a situation this fragile. Lucas and Noah reacted to his presence with the same calm neutrality they had shown before. They acknowledged him, then returned to their games, building elaborate stories with sticks and stones, narrating them in voices so alike that Ethan sometimes lost track of which boy was speaking. He listened carefully, memorizing the differences anyway, the subtle shifts in tone and expression that made them individuals rather than reflections. Sarah remained nearby, always within sight, her presence steady and watchful. She did not interfere, but she did not relax either. Ethan could feel her attention on him, not as suspicion, but as vigilance born of years spent protecting what mattered most. He understood now that trust for her would not come from apologies or visible effort, but from the absence of disappointment over time. Gradually, the boys began to include him without ceremony. Lucas asked him to hold one end of a stick while he balanced another on top. Noah offered him a toy car, then took it back immediately, laughing at his own indecision. Ethan accepted both gestures without reading too much into them, reminding himself that children moved forward instinctively, without the hesitation adults carried like armor. One afternoon, Noah tripped and scraped his knee. The injury was minor, but the shock was not. He froze, eyes wide, breath caught somewhere between surprise and pain. Ethan stood instinctively, then stopped himself, glancing at Sarah for permission. She nodded once. Ethan crouched beside Noah, careful not to overwhelm him. "It hurts," Noah said, more offended than injured. "I know," Ethan replied gently. "But it will pass." Noah studied him for a moment, then leaned closer, allowing Ethan to steady him until the initial sting faded. The moment lasted only seconds, but it left Ethan shaken, acutely aware of how easily trust could be offered, and how devastating it would be to lose it again. Later that evening, Ethan canceled a business dinner without explanation. It was not a strategic decision or a calculated trade-off. It simply felt wrong to prioritize anything else while the echo of that small, unguarded moment still lingered in his mind. Changes followed quietly. He adjusted his schedule, delegating responsibilities he once guarded obsessively. His assistant noticed, then his partners. Questions were asked, framed as concern, as curiosity, as advice. Ethan answered them briefly and without defensiveness. For the first time, he did not feel the need to justify his choices. Sarah noticed the changes too, though she never commented on them directly. What she noticed most was what did not happen. Ethan did not push for unsupervised visits. He did not ask about custody or rights. He did not speak of the future as if it were owed to him. He showed up, stayed within the limits set for him, and left when asked, even when the boys protested softly at his departure. One evening, as she was preparing dinner, Lucas asked her a question that stopped her hands mid-motion. "Is Ethan coming tomorrow?" Sarah hesitated, then answered carefully. "Yes." Lucas nodded, satisfied, and returned to his drawing. The simplicity of the exchange unsettled her more than she expected. She realized that without announcing it, without seeking permission, the boys had begun to factor Ethan into their sense of normal. The realization frightened her, but it also forced her to acknowledge something she had resisted admitting. Ethan was not trying to reclaim the past. He was building something new, patiently and without guarantees. And for the first time since the charity gala, Sarah allowed herself to consider that this slow, careful process might not end in disappointment after all, but in a form of stability none of them had ever known. The shift became noticeable not through any single dramatic moment, but through the accumulation of small, deliberate choices that slowly altered the shape of their days. Ethan stopped thinking in terms of milestones and began thinking in terms of presence. He no longer counted how many visits had passed without incident or how close he was to being trusted. Instead, he focused on being exactly where he was supposed to be, exactly when he was supposed to be there, without expectation of reward. The boys began to recognize this consistency in ways that felt both subtle and profound. They greeted him more easily now, no longer pausing to assess whether he belonged in the space. Lucas started explaining the rules of his games without being asked, growing visibly frustrated if Ethan misunderstood, while Noah took quiet pleasure in correcting him with serious authority. Ethan accepted their instruction with genuine attention, allowing himself to be taught, aware that this reversal of roles mattered more than any authority he could assert. Sarah watched these interactions closely, her vigilance never fully easing. She noticed how Ethan never interrupted the boys when they spoke, how he waited for them to finish even when their stories wandered or repeated themselves. She noticed how he remembered small details, like which boy hated wearing his jacket zipped all the way up and which one insisted on tying his shoes himself even when it took too long. These were not gestures meant to impress. They were habits forming naturally, and that frightened her more than calculated effort would have. The tension arrived quietly, as it often did, in the form of inconvenience. Ethan's work began to demand more of him again. A series of unexpected issues required his attention, and the pressure to return to his old pace was immediate and unrelenting. His phone rang constantly. Emails multiplied. The expectation that he would once again place everything else second felt almost automatic to those around him. This time, he didn't comply. He left meetings early. He declined invitations he would have once accepted without hesitation. When questioned, he offered no elaborate explanations, only calm refusals that left no room for negotiation. The pushback came quickly, wrapped in concern and disbelief, but Ethan absorbed it quietly, aware that every boundary he held now was a boundary he had once failed to respect. The boys felt the change before Sarah did. One afternoon, Lucas asked him directly, "Are you going to disappear like the other people do?" The question landed without malice, spoken with the straightforward honesty of a child who had learned to observe patterns. Ethan didn't answer immediately. He knelt in front of him, lowering himself to eye level, ensuring his words would not feel dismissive or rushed. "No," he said carefully. "I'm staying." Lucas studied his face intently, searching for something invisible. Then he nodded, apparently satisfied, and returned to his game. Sarah overheard the exchange from a short distance away, her chest tightening painfully. That night, long after the boys were asleep, she replayed the moment again and again, recognizing the weight of what had been asked and what had been promised. She finally spoke when Ethan was preparing to leave. "They're beginning to trust you," she said quietly. Ethan met her gaze. "I know. And if you break that trust," she continued, her voice steady but edged with fear, "it won't just hurt them. It will undo everything." "I won't," he replied simply. "Not because I want something from you, but because I know what losing them would mean." The sincerity in his voice left no space for argument, only uncertainty about what came next. Days turned into weeks, and the structure around their interactions loosened slightly, not by request, but by mutual understanding. Ethan was allowed to pick the boys up from the park once. Then twice. Short, clearly defined moments that felt enormous in their implications. Each time, he returned them exactly when promised, resisting every instinct to linger or extend the time. One evening, Noah fell asleep in the back seat during the drive back to Sarah's apartment. Ethan carried him inside carefully, aware of the quiet trust placed in his arms. Noah stirred briefly, murmuring something unintelligible, then settled again, his small hand gripping Ethan's jacket without conscious intent. Sarah watched from the doorway, emotion tightening her throat. In that moment, she understood that the hardest part was no longer keeping Ethan at a distance. It was accepting that his presence was becoming real, rooted, and potentially permanent. And permanence, she knew, was the one thing she had never allowed herself to hope for again. The consequences of Ethan's choices could no longer be contained within the quiet boundaries of parks and carefully timed visits. What had begun as small adjustments to his schedule slowly grew into visible absences that others noticed and questioned. His colleagues, accustomed to his constant availability and decisive control, began to sense that something fundamental had shifted, even if they did not yet understand why. Meetings were shortened or delegated. Business trips were postponed, then quietly cancelled. Ethan stopped answering calls during certain hours, and for the first time in years, he did not explain himself afterward. At first, this was treated as a temporary anomaly, an indulgence afforded to a man who had earned his reputation. Then the indulgence wore thin. The confrontation came on an ordinary weekday afternoon, framed as a discussion but unmistakably edged with pressure. Senior partners sat across from him, voices calm, expressions carefully neutral, each sentence layered with concern disguised as strategy. They spoke of optics. Of leadership presence. Of commitment. Ethan listened without interrupting, his posture relaxed in a way that unsettled them more than defensiveness would have. When it was his turn to speak, he did not raise his voice or justify himself with numbers and projections the way he once would have. "My priorities have changed," he said simply. The room went quiet. One of them leaned forward. "This company requires total focus." Ethan met his gaze steadily. "So do my sons." The words felt final the moment they left his mouth. The reaction was swift. Warnings followed, subtle at first, then more explicit. Suggestions that he take a step back. That he consider whether he could continue in his role at the same level of involvement. That perhaps someone else should temporarily take the lead. Ethan heard all of it. He did not argue. When he told Sarah that evening, the weight of it pressed heavily on both of them. She listened in silence as he explained what was happening, her hands resting loosely in her lap, her expression unreadable. "You don't have to do this," she said finally. "I never asked you to give up your life." Ethan shook his head. "I gave it up the day I chose not to listen to you," he replied quietly. "I'm just finally paying attention to what matters." The boys felt the tension without understanding its source. Lucas became quieter for a few days, watching Ethan more closely, as if looking for signs of change. Noah asked questions he hadn't asked before, simple but sharp ones that cut through any attempt at distraction. "Are you going away?" he asked one evening as Ethan helped him put on his jacket. Ethan paused, then knelt to face him. "No," he said firmly. "I'm not going away." Noah studied him for a long moment, then nodded, seemingly satisfied, though the question lingered in the air long after. The breaking point came sooner than expected. A late afternoon call from Sarah interrupted one of Ethan's meetings. Her voice was calm but tight. "Noah fell at preschool," she said. "It's not serious, but he's scared. I can't get there right away." Ethan stood before she finished the sentence. He arrived at the clinic before Sarah, finding Noah sitting stiffly on a small examination bed, tears streaking his cheeks despite his effort to be brave. The moment Noah saw him, he reached out without hesitation. Ethan held him, murmuring reassurance, absorbing the tremble in his small body, acutely aware of how instinctive the trust felt. When Sarah arrived and saw them together, something in her expression shifted, a quiet recognition she could not ignore. That night, after the boys were asleep, Sarah finally allowed her fear to surface. "They're attached now," she said softly. "If this falls apart, they won't understand why." Ethan did not rush to comfort her with promises. He spoke carefully, deliberately. "I already lost them once," he said. "I won't survive doing that again." The next morning, Ethan made his decision official. He stepped back from his role, not dramatically, not publicly, but decisively. The announcement sent ripples through the company, speculation following immediately, but Ethan paid little attention. For the first time, he felt no urge to defend himself to people who would never fully understand. What mattered was the quiet apartment where two boys waited for him to arrive, where trust was fragile and unspoken, and where his presence meant more than authority ever had. Sarah watched him walk that path with a mixture of fear and awe, realizing that the man who once dismissed her with a single sentence was now dismantling his own empire piece by piece to prove that he would not walk away again. And for the first time since the charity gala, she allowed herself to believe that this story might not end in loss, but in something far more difficult and far more rare. Staying. The quiet that followed Ethan's decision felt almost unreal, as if the world had taken a cautious step back to see what would happen next. There were no dramatic headlines, no sudden applause or condemnation, only a steady shift in the rhythm of his days. Mornings no longer began with urgent calls or rushed meetings, but with the sound of small voices arguing over breakfast and the soft chaos of getting two 4-year-olds ready for the day. Lucas and Noah adapted quickly, as children often did when consistency finally replaced uncertainty. They stopped asking where Ethan had to go and started assuming he would be there. They argued over who got to sit next to him, competed for his attention with exaggerated stories, and complained loudly when he tried to multitask. Ethan learned to listen fully, to put things down when they spoke, to treat their words as important simply because they mattered to them. Sarah watched the change with a mix of guarded relief and lingering fear. She had spent years building a life where disappointment was manageable because expectations were low. Allowing hope back in felt dangerous, like standing too close to an open edge. Still, she couldn't ignore what she saw. Ethan showed up not just for the boys, but for the unremarkable moments that made up real life. He stayed when days were dull, when moods were unpredictable, when nothing impressive or heroic was required of him. One afternoon, as they walked home from the park, Lucas slipped his hand into Ethan's without thinking, his grip small but confident. Noah followed immediately, grabbing Ethan's other hand, laughing as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Ethan froze for a brief second, then continued walking, afraid that any acknowledgement might shatter the moment. Sarah walked beside them, her chest tightening painfully as she realized how seamlessly the boys had accepted him into their world. Later that evening, when the apartment was quiet and the boys were asleep, Sarah and Ethan sat at opposite ends of the couch, the space between them filled with thoughts neither had voiced yet. "You didn't have to give up so much," Sarah said softly. "You already missed enough because of one mistake." Ethan looked at her steadily. "I didn't lose anything I needed," he replied. "I lost the version of myself that thought being right mattered more than being present." The honesty in his voice left Sarah without a response. She realized then that what frightened her most was no longer the possibility that he would leave, but the reality that he was staying, that he was building something without demanding recognition or control. The past did not disappear. There were difficult conversations ahead, moments of doubt, and scars that would never fully fade. But the weight of that past no longer pressed down on every decision. It had become part of the story rather than the force that defined it. Weeks turned into months, and the boys began to call Ethan Dad without ceremony or permission, as if the word had simply found its place. Ethan never corrected them, never celebrated the moment aloud, but every time he heard it, he felt the quiet confirmation that he was exactly where he needed to be. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the apartment in warm light, Sarah stood at the window watching Lucas and Noah play in the yard below, their laughter rising easily through the open glass. Ethan joined her, standing close but not touching. "You know," Sarah said quietly, "I spent years thinking that sentence you said ended everything." Ethan nodded. "It almost did. But it didn't," she continued. "It showed me who you were then. And who you've chosen to be now." He turned to her, his expression open and steady. "I don't expect you to forget." "I won't," she replied. "But I don't want to live inside that moment forever." Ethan reached for her hand slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to. She didn't. Her fingers curled around his, tentative but real. Outside, the boys ran toward the building, calling for them both at once. Ethan smiled, a genuine, unguarded expression that once would have felt unfamiliar. Sometimes one sentence is enough to destroy a life. And sometimes, owning that sentence, learning from it, and choosing differently every day afterward becomes the foundation of something stronger, quieter, and far more honest than anything certainty ever built. This time, no one pretended to be right. They chose to stay together.